If there's one thing that we enjoy in Rocket League, it's chaos. And this regional had plenty of it. And you know what? We have a lot to talk about, so I'm not even going to waste too much time on an intro. So with that said, let's get into it. Starting in Group A, we had Gen.g, Complexity, Dignitas, and Koi. Dignitas and Koi both came into this event fresh off a roster change, with Koi bringing in Knight and Dignitas bringing in the young star Evo. Complexity made it to the main event after beating Furia in the tiebreaker to qualify, and they looked really good in that match, so it was going to be interesting to see if they could continue that form here. And then Gen.g is fresh off a win in the Fall Major, in case you hadn't heard. The first two rounds in that group went about how you'd expect, with Gen.g and Complexity both beating Koi and Dignitas. Gen.g looked a lot more dominant, taking both of their wins in sweeps, and Complexity had to deal with more of a fight, especially against Dignitas, where they had to shut down an attempted reverse sweep in Game 5. So those results gave us a matchup of 2-0 teams between Complexity and Gen.g, and a matchup of 0-2 teams between Koi and Dignitas. In that 0-2 matchup, Koi got off to a fast start, taking 2 straight overtime wins in Game 1 and 2, quickly getting themselves to series point. But after those games, Dig outscored Koi 7-3, and they took the last 3 games of the series to pull off the reverse sweep and eliminate Koi from the tournament in the group stage, in addition to sending them closer to some very unfortunate history. So far in this RLCS season, this Rogue/Koi roster has played 12 series so far, and they've lost all of them. The only other RLCS team to start off their season by losing 12 straight series was the team that was first known as Morning Light in the RLCS X season. So if Koi qualify for the next event, and they lose in their first series there, then they'll have that record all to themselves. And since they would come into the next event as the 4th seed in their group, that means that their first series would be against that group's first seed. So unless they pull off a massive upset the next time we see them, they're going to be a part of some unfortunate RLCS history. The Gen.g and Complexity series started off as a really close one too, with Game 1 and 3 going to Complexity in overtime, and Game 2 going to Gen.g after a last-second go-ahead goal from Nali. With how tight the first 3 games were, it looked like this series was destined for a Game 5. But after that, I guess Complexity decided that they were done messing around, because they dominated in Game 4, winning that game 4-0 and winning the series, giving them a 3-0 record in the group and a spot directly into the quarterfinal of the playoffs as their group's number 1 seed. And this series was the continuation of a pretty surprising trend. Before this series, if I had asked who's the better team between Complexity and Gen.g, I'm willing to bet most of you would have said Gen.g. But to this point in the season, Gen.g and Complexity have played each other in 3 separate series, once in the top 16 qualifier, once in the Fall Cup, and again here in the Winter Open. Complexity had won all 3 of those matches, and they did so dominantly, because in the total games within those series, Complexity won 9 games, and Gen.g won once. I'm not sure what it is about this matchup that gives Complexity the upper hand, but it'll definitely be interesting to see how Gen.g respond the next time these 2 teams play. So when Group A was all said and done, we had Complexity in first, Gen.g in second, Dignitas in third, and Koi in last. Next up, in Group B we had FaZe Clan, Furia, Shopify Rebellion, and Knights. Furia had to be the team to watch in this group, because they were the only team in the top 10 in North America to make a roster change between the fall and winter split. They brought in Lost from the club in South America, replacing Kaio TG1, in a move that looked likely to increase this team's speed and offensive firepower. This was the group that had the most upset potential out of all 4 groups in the event, because even though FaZe and Furia were the 2 favorites, this was the only group in the event that featured 4 different teams that all made it to a top 8 at least once during the fall split. So on the right day, both Knights and Rebellion could beat some really good teams. But when they started playing the games, only one of those teams came close to pulling off an upset. Because in the first 2 rounds, Knights took both Furia and FaZe to Game 5, but still ended up losing both times. Meanwhile, Rebellion lost both of their matches in the sweep. So heading into the matchup of the 0-2 teams, Knights looked like they were in much better form than their opponents. And based off of that form, they had to be considered the favorites heading into this series. And from the moment Game 1 started, Knights showed why they were the favorite, scoring their first goal 8 seconds into Game 1. And from there, they didn't let up until the series was over. They took this series in 4 games and eliminated Shopify from the competition. But on the other side of round 3 in this group, FaZe and Furia played a really competitive series, going all the way to 5 games and being my pick for the best series out of the entire group stage. These 2 teams alternated wins through the entire series, including an especially intense match in Game 3. In this game, FaZe took the lead at 3 different points, but Furia was able to come back every time. FaZe scored the first goal to go up 1-0, but then Furia was able to score right back. Then FaZe went up 3-1, and then Furia scored the next 2 goals to tie it up 3-3. Then FaZe took the lead for a final time, going up 4-3, but then Furia scored immediately after that to tie it up again at 4. Then finally, Furia scored one last time in overtime to take the win in Game 3 and go up 2-1 in the series. After a shutout win from FaZe in Game 4, Furia was able to respond one last time and get their own shutout win in Game 5, winning the series 3-2 despite a pretty heroic effort from First Killer. He averaged 1 goal per game and 3.4 saves per game this series, and was involved on every single one of FaZe's goals except for one. And on top of that, some of the highlights that he made were pretty crazy, but every time he made a play, Furia was able to respond with their own play. And that resilience from this team is what led them to victory in this series and to first place in the group overall. So the final standings for Group B was Furia first, FaZe second, Knights third, and Rebellion last. Group C featured version 1, G2, Team Axel, and a crew. And while it feels kinda mean to call this the worst group in the event, it was very clear that there are two different tiers within this group. V1 and G2 were both major qualifiers, and they are both teams that were very capable of winning the whole tournament on the right day. There were some questions coming in about version 1's mentality after the whole fiasco with Rise's botched transfer move to version 1, and Khan being brought back to the team after nearly everybody thought he was already out the door. But even taking that into account, a lot of people still had high expectations for this team. And then the other two teams were Crew and Axel, who had much lower expectations, to say the least. If either of those teams got a win off of G2 or V1, it would have been considered a huge upset. Both of those teams had 2 chances to pull off that type of upset in the first 2 rounds, but neither one of them were able to get it done, as the 2 higher seeded teams in this group won the first 2 rounds pretty comfortably. So this gave us a fight between Axel and a Crew to avoid elimination, and this fight was preceded by a lot of trash talk on social media, especially on Axel's side. So while avoiding last place in the group was enough incentive, it still felt like there was just a little bit extra on the line between these two teams. But while there was some back and forth on social media before the series got started, when they actually started playing the games, a Crew was the only one to put up a fight. They won the series in a 3-0 sweep and outscored Axel 9-2. And to add insult to injury, they gave him one final dagger on social media. Cold. The fight for first place in this group wasn't as dominant, but it was still pretty one-sided between V1 and G2. G2 won the series in 4 games, and we saw a pretty dominant performance from Atomic. Usually when I'm talking about him, I'm bringing up how good his passing is and how many assists he manages to get all the time, being able to take over a series with his playmaking. But in this series, Atomic dominated with his scoring. He scored 7 of the 11 goals that G2 scored in the series, and with V1 only scoring 6 goals in total, Atomic outscored them by himself. It was a top-level performance from a top-level player, and even if V1 were playing to the best of their ability in this series, which it kinda seemed like they weren't, they still would have had a very tough time trying to handle Atomic. So with those results, the final standings for Group C was G2 first, version 1 second, a Crew third, and Team Axel last. Finally in the group stage, we had Group D, which had Space Station, NRG, Optic, and M80. And this could have very well been the most evenly matched group out of all 4, especially between the top 3 teams. So while Space Station was the favorite coming into it, it wouldn't have been too much of a surprise to see Optic or NRG walk away with this group either. Although Optic had some question marks coming into the series too. Because when Rise was expected to go to version 1, Calm was expected to go to this team, and they were going to drop Magic Bear to do that. But just like Calm on version 1, when Rise's transfer fell through, Magic Bear went from being a player who was on his way out the door to a player that was now going to stick with his team for at least one more split. And there was a lot of interest in whether or not this would affect this team's mentality, and consequently, their gameplay. In round 1, we had Space Station beating M80 in a sweep, and we had NRG beating Optic in 4 games with a very good defensive performance, shutting out Optic in 3 of those 4 games. Then round 2 got a little more spicy, because Optic was able to take the upset win over Space Station with Redos beating his old team, and Optic getting 1-0 victories in Game 3 and Game 4. And they also played in the longest overtime so far this season, with Game 1 going into 11 minutes and 13 seconds of overtime, so that's also pretty cool. While that was going on, M80 took NRG to the brink, going up 2-1 in that series. But in the final 2 games, NRG locked in on defense and shut out M80 in Game 4 and 5, winning the series 3-2. So heading into the final round of that group, NRG had a 2-0 record, M80 had an 0-2 record, and both Space Station and Optic had a 1-1 record. And all the possible scenarios were kinda crazy, because anybody except for M80 could have won the group, and anybody except for NRG could have been eliminated. So there were a bunch of possibilities. NRG was looking to secure first place in the group with a win over Space Station, but that proved to be much easier said than done, because after their loss to Optic, Space Station came out hot and took this series in a 3-0 sweep. And on the other side of round 3, we got what was the biggest upset of the tournament to this point, with M80 beating Optic in 4 games. M80 played really well and they definitely deserve to be moving on to the playoffs, but this is still a really tough loss for Optic. It's a pretty crazy scenario for a team to beat the group's #1 seed and still get eliminated, but that's exactly what the scenario was for Optic in this tournament. So the final standings for this group was Space Station first, NRG second, M80 third, and Optic last. So after the group stage was all said and done, we had these matches in round 1 of the playoffs. Some of these series looked like they would be pretty good, but at the same time, all 4 of them had a very clear favorite that most people expected to win. But while the tournament had already been pretty entertaining to this point, things were about to get a lot crazier. The first matchup was FaZe against M80, and while M80 did look pretty good in the group stage, FaZe was a step above all the other teams they had played in the group stage, including Space Station. So there was pretty much no way that M80 would be able to pull this out. Game 1 went to FaZe in a close matchup that ended 1-0. Then Game 2 went to overtime, with M80 pulling out the win this time 4-3. So M80 proved that they could actually play them pretty close so far. And Game 3 was no different, because we got another match that went into overtime. And M80 was able to pull out the win again, this time winning with a score of 3-2. So now they're up 2-1 in the series, and on match point against FaZe Clan. But after 3 straight close games, Game 4 was completely different, with a 4-1 victory for M80. And with that win, they completed the unexpected victory over FaZe Clan and pulled off what has to be the biggest upset that we've seen so far this season in North America. With their big win over Optic in the group stage, and now their big win over FaZe in the playoffs, M80 were pulling together a nice little run in this event, and they are starting to look like a team that nobody wanted to play. Next we had version 1 going up against Dignitas, and after a huge upset in the other match in this round, this was more of the same. If you didn't know anything about these teams while watching the series, then you would have thought that Dignitas was the favorite, because they played like it. They dominated from start to finish and won this series in a 3-0 sweep. They were especially good on defense, because they only allowed version 1 to score 2 goals in the 3 games, despite averaging 9 shots per game. V1 just couldn't break through their defense, and then after a while, version 1 would slip up on their defensive end, allowing Dignitas to score. And that was pretty much the story of the series. For version 1, the next tournament will be a serious check for their mentality. After the roster move that fell through before the start of this split, and now their disappointing result in the Winter Open, it's very easy to see things going downhill for this team. Version 1's season is now at a crossroads, and it'll be very interesting to see where they go from here. So now we've had 2 big upsets in the first round of the playoffs, but you'd think that if there's one team that was safe from an upset, it would be Gen.g in their match against the Crew. But they couldn't have gotten off to a much shakier start, because in their first game, they lost 3-0. This looked like it could have been the start of another huge upset in this tournament, but after game 1, Gen.g tightened up. The next 3 games in the series were all really close, especially game 4, where Gen.g had to pull out a 0-second goal to send it into overtime. But even with the good fight that the Crew put up, Gen.g won all 3 of these games, and they walked away with the series win 3-1, moving on to the quarterfinals themselves and sending the Crew home in the process. For the last match in round 1, after 2 big upsets and 1 match that was way closer than anybody expected, we had the match that most people would have thought had the biggest upset potential in NRG versus Knights. NRG was definitely looked at as the favorite in the series, but they were the favorite the last time these 2 teams played too. During the Fall Invitational, NRG was just outside of major contention, and they needed to get a pretty good finish in order to give themselves a realistic shot at qualifying. But then, when round 5 of the Swiss stage came around, they had to face Knights in a matchup that should have been favorable for NRG. But Knights ended up winning that series, and they completely shut down all of NRG's major hopes right there. And although this match in the Winter Open didn't have quite the same circumstances around it, it still would have been a great time for NRG to get their revenge. And after NRG won the series 3-0, I think they did just that. It's funny how NRG started the playoffs in the match that had the biggest upset potential, and then went on to have the smoothest victory out of all 4 of the higher seeds in this round. And with the way that NRG were looking in their games, it was looking very possible for them to extend their run past the top 8. But in order to do that, they would need to get past an old rival, because in the quarterfinals, they got matched up against G2. NRG had looked pretty good so far this tournament, but this match would be the one to determine whether or not they are ready to contend for the top of North America again. And while there were a bunch of contenders for this title, I personally thought that this was the best series out of the entire tournament. It was an intense matchup between 2 old rivals, with a lot on the line, and the gameplay on the pitch was just about as good as you could expect. There were a bunch of tight games and a bunch of nerve-wracking moments, mostly brought on by G2's unrelenting pressure and NRG using their great defense to try to hold them off. Justin was especially heroic on the defensive end, and there were a bunch of moments where he reminded everybody why he's one of the best goal line defenders in the entire world. In game 1, after Squishy got demoed in goal, Justin had to run back to the goal from the corner and make the save on J-Naps' shot, and he was able to get there just in time to clear the ball off to the side and make it so that Chicago couldn't get off an easy follow-up shot. Because if Justin's save didn't turn into a good clear, then Chicago would have been right there to finish the job. Then just a few seconds later, after Garrett gets demoed, Justin is again on his own in NRG's net. Chicago gets the ball and pulls off a nice flick, which Justin was in the area to save. But he doesn't get a touch on it because it instead went right into the crossbar and bounced down into the ground with a lot of force, which popped it straight up in the air and a perfect spot for J-Naps to get the follow-up shot. After coming off the back wall, Justin has to boost down to the ground to speed up his recovery so that he can get back up in the air in time to contest J-Naps' shot. Then Justin jumps to make the save before J-Naps even makes his touch. And even with J-Naps' shot bouncing off the crossbar first, Justin is still able to get a really strong touch on it, and he again clears the ball into a spot where G2 can't follow up quickly. Then after one more soft shot from Atomic, Justin's able to pass the ball off to the corner to Squishy, and Justin was able to keep NRG's net clear once again. On the back of some great defense by Justin and the entire team, NRG went on to win Game 1 2-0. But after G2 finally started managing to break through NRG, they were able to take the next 2 games in the series and go up 2-1 heading into Game 4. It was vital that NRG won this game to give themselves a chance of winning the whole series, because going down 3-1 against G2 is something that's very hard to come back from, no matter how well you're playing. And with the 2-1 lead heading into the final seconds of Game 4, it looked like NRG were about to get that win. But after a scramble at 0 seconds and a perfect shot from Atomic to get past Squishy, G2 took the game in overtime. And after fighting for an extra 5 minutes and 41 seconds, G2 were the ones to score the overtime goal, and they went up 3-1 in the series. Game 5 was another tight battle, but the momentum for G2 was just too much to overcome, and they took that game too, winning the series 4-1. Even though this series only lasted 5 games, it was an intense battle the entire way through. And I think NRG should at least be a little bit satisfied with how they played, even if it wasn't enough to get the win this time. For the second match in the quarterfinals, we had Furia going up against Gen.g. And just like G won in the European Winter Open, Furia won their group, and then immediately went on to face the best team in the region in their first match of the playoffs. So, once again, congratulations. Furia did pretty well in the group stage, but if they're able to win this matchup, then they would have gotten off to a very good start for qualifying for the Winter Major. But that would prove to be a very difficult challenge. And when it came down to it, Gen.g proved to be too much to handle. They won the series 4-1, and they were in control the entire time. Even in the one game that they lost in Game 4, the only time that Furia managed to hold a lead was at the very end when they scored in overtime. For the rest of that game, they were fighting from behind to try to catch up to Gen.g. I wouldn't say that Furia looked bad or anything, and in fact, throughout the course of this event, they looked like they were a better team than they were last split. But like I said when they first made this move, the top of North America is very crowded right now, and it's going to be tough for them to break through for major qualification. They're definitely good enough to do it, but it would certainly help if they got some luckier breaks and didn't have to play against teams like Gen.g in the quarterfinals of tournaments. But all things considered, I think this team should be very proud of how they played. Now with the first 2 quarterfinal matches out of the way, we moved into the quote-unquote easier side of the bracket. G2 versus NRG and Furia versus Gen.g were both really good matchups, with all 4 teams involved having a really high ceiling. But on the top side of the bracket, the matches seemed like they'd be a little more lopsided. And the first of those matches was Space Station versus Dignitas. The game started off about how you would expect. Dignitas proved that they would be able to put up a fight, but Space Station had the upper hand at first, going up 2-1 in the series. But after a Game 4 win from Dig, we had a crucial Game 5 with the teams tied at 2 games apiece. And the most important game of the series also gave us the most intense game, with the teams being tied at 2 goals apiece going into overtime, and then fighting for 6 minutes and 26 seconds in that overtime. But after a good play from Dries to collect Daniel's clear in the corner, and then slow the play down to get the ball around Arsenal and feed it to Andy for a wide open goal, Dignitas took the lead in the series, and they were 1 game away from pulling yet another big upset in this tournament. But then after that game, Dignitas called a timeout. Usually after a big game in the series, the losing team will be the one to call a timeout. And it's pretty common for the team calling the timeout to go on to win the next game. So much so that it's often referred to as the timeout buff. It's extremely rare for a team to call a timeout after winning a game. But this unusual call from Dignitas ended up working out perfectly, because they went on to take Game 6 for themselves, winning the entire series and moving on to Championship Sunday. And with this loss, this is also the first time this season that Space Station failed to make it to the semifinals in the regional event. In the last quarterfinal, M80 looked to keep the upset trend going. After M80 won against Optic in the group stage, and again against FaZe Clan in round 1, Complexity definitely couldn't afford to overlook this team, especially after M80 got off to a hot start, scoring the first goal in the series 12 seconds into Game 1. But that goal right there would be the most momentum that MAD ever got in the series, because after that first goal, Complexity scored every other goal in that game, and they took game 1 by a score of 4-1. And then game 2 was literally more of the same, with Complexity winning 4-1 again. Then Complexity got another win in game 3, this time only needing 1 goal to do so. And after M80 managed to claw their way to their own 1-0 victory in game 4, Complexity finished off the series in game 5 with yet another 4-1 victory. After coming into this tournament with most people picking them to finish last in their group, making it all the way to the quarterfinals is a huge result for M80, and especially Lionblaze, who I've been pretty high on since the start of last season. For him to make it to the top 8 for the first time since Event 1 in last season's Spring Split is a huge result, and I can't wait to see where he and the rest of his team goes from here. So after all of that, we finally head into Championship Sunday, and the first match of the day was G2 against Gen.g, the former best team in North America facing off against the new best team in North America. People were really split on who they thought would win this series, but regardless of their prediction, just about everybody expected a tight back and forth battle, because when two teams that are this good face off, we usually don't see anything less than that. But after G2 scored the first goal in game 1, this series was all Gen.g, and I mean literally all Gen.g. G2 didn't even take the lead in a single game for the rest of the series. G2 managed to be ahead in the game for only 26 seconds, and the Gen.g attack couldn't have been more balanced. They scored 13 total goals in the series, with Chronic scoring 4, Nolly scoring 4, and apparently Jack scoring 5. If you're facing a three-headed monster on offense like this, where all 3 players are equally capable of being the main threat, then it's going to be very, very hard to stop them, and G2 found that out the hard way. And to cap off the series, in their 6-1 win in game 4, Nolly got what I like to call Rocket League's triple-double, because he finished with a hat-trick, a playmaking medal, and a savior medal, getting 3 goals, 3 assists, and 4 saves. Doing this is always pretty rare, because in order for it to happen, a team needs to score at least 6 goals. And if they score exactly 6, then the player needs to be involved in all of them. But Nolly managed to pull that off, and I think that deserves a little bit of extra credit. After this win, the 3 teams left in the tournament were Gen.g, Complexity, and Dignitas, who all came from Group A. Not many people thought of them as the group of death before the tournament started, but now it can't be argued that Group A was the best in the tournament. And it just goes to show how unlucky Koi was to be matched up against these teams. In the other semifinal matchup, we had Dignitas looking to continue their streak of upsets against Complexity. And with momentum on their side after 2 huge upsets, people were starting to believe in Dignitas going all the way to the grand final. And they got off to a good start in the series by taking a 1-0 win in game 1. But after this good start from Dignitas, just like the semifinal match that happened before, this ended up being completely one-sided. In the final 4 games of the series, Dignitas only scored 1 goal. And technically, they didn't even score that, because the goal that Dignitas got was actually an own goal when Evo threw the ball off of CRR, and it deflected into Complexity's own net. But after that, Complexity scored 10 goals that would be unanswered by Dignitas, and they ran away with the series in the 4-1 victory, securing their spot in the grand finals. As we headed into the final match of the tournament, we had a couple of interesting storylines to hang on to. One, it was a rematch of the series that they played in the group stage, where Complexity had won, just like they had every other time these 2 teams matched up this season. So in the most important series that these 2 teams have played against each other so far, this was the perfect chance for Gen.g to get their revenge. The other thing worth noting is that even though this was a North American grand final, it wasn't very North American. Out of the 6 players that were playing in the series, only one of them was actually from North America. Everybody else was either from Europe or from South America, so maybe this is what it meant when America was called the land of the free. Getting into the series, Gen.g immediately took control, because they scored their first 2 goals 16 seconds into game 1. And that momentum kept going for a while, because they went on to win game 1 5-1, and then they won game 2 2-0. So in game 3, Complexity were already down 2 games, and they had to get a win here if they wanted to have a chance in the series, because with how Gen.g were looking, a reverse sweep in the best of 7 was not going to happen. But we saw Complexity step up, and they got a huge win in game 3, taking that game 7-1 and getting the only Brazil in the entire tournament, which is pretty fitting for a team that came from South America. That loss was apparently big enough for Gen.g to take their time out right there, despite still being up in the series 2-1. And that was probably the right decision, because when a team wins by that much in the game, then there's likely something that has to be fixed. Game 4 gave us our tightest game of the series, and the only one that went into overtime, with the teams being tied up at 2 when the clock struck 0. But about 3 minutes into that overtime, we see an accidental backflip from CRR, which gives Chronic the space he needs to air dribble over the defense and pass the ball to Nolly, who puts in the overtime goal and gives Gen.g the 3-1 lead heading into game 5. And in that game 5, what we saw from Gen.g was pretty much exactly what we saw for most of the tournament. Their offense was too much for Complexity to keep up with, and they walked away with the Game 5 win, the series win, and of course, the regional win. Gen.g is starting to approach some unprecedented territory with the form that they're in right now. They've made it to the Grand Finals in 5 straight tournaments, and they've won their last 3 tournaments, including a win in an international LAN. It's still kind of early to say this, but if this team is able to keep up this form, then they're going to be looked at as Rocket League's next great dynasty, alongside the old Dignitas roster with Panda, K-Dop, and Turbo, and the Team BDS roster from RLCS. We still have a little bit of time before they reach that level, but honestly, I'm liking their chances of getting there. Now that we've gone through the North American regional, let's get into the best of the rest, where I talk about the other region's RLCS events from last weekend. And also, shout out to my guy Kyle for being the first one to suggest the name. Starting with the Middle East, I don't think it's unfair to call this a 2-team region. Sure, there are some other squads that are competitive and can put up a fight, but when it comes down to it, there are only 2 teams that everyone expects to have a chance of making it to the major. One of them is the legendary Team Falcons, and with Ahmad, Khaled, and TRK on their team, I doubt that they need much of an introduction. And the other team was Rule 1. With Rawas and Kalirs on their team, they're always going to have a good shot. But picking up Mawson in the transfer window only made those chances even better. And this team is my personal pick to make it to the Winter Major out of this region. The group stage went pretty smoothly for both of these teams, with Team Falcons getting through without dropping a single game, and Rule 1 only dropping 1 game. Meanwhile, the winners of the other 2 groups were Vision Esports, which is Senzo's team, and Cola, who defeated the number 1 seed in their group, Twisted Minds, which was Mawson's old team. Then heading into the quarterfinals, we got more of the same from the region's best 2 teams. Team Falcons won their quarterfinal match in 5 games, while Rule 1 took theirs in a sweep. Then Rule 1 got another sweep in the semifinals, but Falcons ran into a pretty serious hurdle there. They went up against Cola, the winners of Group D, and they got off to a really bad start. Falcons lost the first 2 games of the series, and then after winning Game 3, they went on to lose Game 4 as well, going down 3-1 in the series and being at serious risk of being upset. But Falcons did exactly what a great team has to do, and they came through when it mattered most. They won the next 3 games, allowing only 1 goal in those games combined, and they came back to win the series in 7 games. So after that quick upset scare, we got the matchup in the Grand Finals that we all expected to, with Falcons going up against Rule 1. And after Falcons just barely made it to the Grand Finals, with Rule 1 making it in pretty easily, Rule 1 became the favorite to win the entire thing. But even though it looked like they may have had their backs against the wall heading into the series, Team Falcons didn't play like that at all, and they dominated in the series, winning a 4-0 sweep. And the unlikely determining factor in the series was old Khaled on offense. Khaled has always been this team's go-to defender, but in this series, he led the team in scoring, which is something he doesn't do very often. And another huge factor in this series was the fact that Falcons were able to completely shut down Mawson. This player was brought in to give Rule 1 the edge over Falcons, but when the teams finally met, Mawson wasn't able to get a single goal or a single assist in the entire series, and was completely neutralized from beginning to end. So now Falcons have taken the early lead over Rule 1 in the race to major qualification, but I still think that this is a race that's going to go all the way down to the finish line. Moving into the OCE regional, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. The first was that they had a wild transfer window, because out of the 20 different teams that earned points during the fall split, 11 of those teams sacrificed the points that they had earned in order to make roster moves, which is absolutely unheard of. But the most interesting thing was that the biggest roster move of the split was Pioneers dropping Super Lucky and picking up Hunter in his place, which I thought was a pretty questionable move. And after leaving Pioneers, Super Lucky went to Ground Zero alongside Kaka and Fiber. And if that wasn't interesting enough, Pioneers and Ground Zero got matched up in the same group, so we would get a grudge match between them pretty quickly. When these 2 teams finally squared off in the group stage, it was a completely one-sided fight, with Ground Zero being the ones to take the series in the sweep. All 3 of the games were pretty tight, with each of them being decided by 1 goal, but Ground Zero was in enough control to come out on top each time. The rest of the group stage in OCE was pretty standard, except for Group D, where Direwolves came in as the 1 seed, but ended up getting swept by 2 different teams, and they just managed to get through the group in 3rd place. In the quarterfinals of the playoffs, the most intense match was Power going up against Pioneers. This was a matchup of 2 of the top teams in OCE, but Power was a clear favorite. They looked good at first, taking the Game 1 win 3-0, but the rest of the series for Power was defined by uncharacteristic misses and missed opportunities that Pioneers were able to pounce on. And because of that, KCP won the series in 6 games and knocked out Power in the quarterfinals. Power was everybody's favorite to make it to the major out of this region, and a loss this early in the tournament will surely set them back. But the good news for Power is that in the first event of the fall split, Power was knocked out in the quarterfinals there too, and they still went on to make it to the major after winning the next 2 events. So they've dug themselves in a bit of a hole after this quarterfinal loss, but if anybody can get out of it to make it to the major, they can. The rest of the quarterfinals and the semifinals were honestly pretty uneventful, because Pioneers and Ground Zero both easily won their semifinal matchup to make it to the grand final, where Pioneers would get a chance at redemption after their pretty embarrassing loss in the group stage. Meanwhile, Super Lucky and Ground Zero were looking to finish off a perfect regional, because they hadn't dropped a single game yet in this event. When the series started, Ground Zero picked up right where they left off against KCP, and won the first 3 games of the series. Ground Zero was 1 game away from the perfect regional, and Super Lucky was 1 win away from getting revenge on his old team twice. Then, in the Game 4 overtime, with the score tied at 4, after 2 minutes in, the game-winning goal was finally scored, by Pioneers. So Ground Zero literally fell 1 goal short of their perfect regional, which would have been an absolutely crazy start for a team's first time ever playing together. But they bounced back in Game 5 to win 2-0, so they still got the regional win, which I'm sure they'll take. So now with Power looking to climb their way back up the standings, this OCE major race is going to be very interesting going forward. Alright, recap's over, and I'll see you all next week for Europe. Like, comment, subscribe, join my Discord, follow me on Twitter, and of course, thanks for watching.